So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Judy Chan, Deputy Director of Digital Services at C2C. This is the second meeting of the Cradle-to-Career Workforce Data Expansion Task Force. Thank you to task force members for being here today. We are grateful for your time and expertise to help guide the development of our P20W data system. Also, thank you to members of the public who have joined us today. I'll walk us through the agenda for today. The meeting has several parts. In just a moment, I'll go over how you can share your input. Then we'll provide a recap of the task force meeting from last month. The second part of the meeting, we will provide responses to task force member questions, and we'll be joined by Abby Snay, Deputy Secretary for Workforce Strategy at the Labor and Workforce Development Agency. After that, we will have an interactive discussion on future dashboard visualizations. Task force members can provide input on how data from LWDA could be displayed in dashboards and be made useful for the public. We will then close with plans for future meetings. You can find meeting materials on our workforce data expansion page, which we'll drop in the chat in a moment. So next slide, please. So throughout the meeting, task force members have access to chat, so you'll be able to comment verbally or via chat. For members of the public, you can use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to pose questions. Our team may not be able to get to all questions today, but please submit your questions because your questions can help inform the content and conversations for future meetings. You also have the option of submitting public comment to info@c2c.ca.gov. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Kathy Booth from WestEd, who will lead us through today's meeting, starting with highlights from the first meeting in January. Kathy?
Thank you so much, Judy. So as you mentioned, this is our second meeting. So I just want to make sure that we recap all the good stuff that happened last month. So for starters, Marianne Bates, who's the executive director for Cradle-to-Career, explained how the idea of including workforce data fit into the broader arc of developing what's known as the P20W data set. So that's the analytical data set that will be available through Cradle-to-Career that will power things like dashboards or allow you to generate queries or to have researchers request access to do more sophisticated analyses using unitary de-identified data. The next thing that happened in the meeting was that Abby Snay, the Deputy Secretary from the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, talked everybody through a memo that came from the Secretary of Labor, Stuart Knox, about the priority research questions that the Labor Agency had identified that related to workforce information. And then from that, they had generated a list of data points that they plan to share with C2C to enrich the existing P20W data set. And they also then identified a number of additional data points that would need to be provided by other entities to help to answer the full range of their questions. So for those of you who missed our meeting last time, I strongly suggest that you go to the website that's listed at the top of this screen. It's a part of the C2C website where you can download a copy of that memo and really get a strong understanding of the incredible breadth of data that the Labor Agency is already prepared to provide. And then we had an opportunity for the task force members to identify the questions that they have about the data points. And those reflected both questions they had about the data that C2C already has in the P20W data set, the way that data is gathered and structured, and questions they had for the labor agency. So the first third of this meeting is really going to focus on answering all of those questions. And again, if you want to get a better sense of the input and the way these questions were framed coming from the members of the task force, also at that web link above, you can see the notes, and that is a document that we refresh after each meeting, so that you have one place where you can go and sort of see a summary of the input from the task force members. And then finally, the task force members brainstormed additional research questions that they think should be answered in this domain of expanding to include workforce data. And that is helping to both understand whether the research agenda developed by the labor agency is reflective of the types of questions that would come from other types of stakeholders, namely all the members of our task force that represent a broad range of perspectives, everything from researchers to practitioners to advocates. So that was what we did in our last meeting. And so what I want to do is sort of highlight, because we had a chance to then go through all of that input and synthesize it a little bit. So the first point here, I think, is a very positive one, which was that many of the questions that the task force members identified really aligned with the research agenda that the labor agency had laid out, but they did offer some really helpful additional nuance or additional points of inquiry that could be addressed when the data from the labor agency gets added to the existing P20W data set. So I just picked out two. These are sort of random. There were a lot of great suggestions, but one example of this was a question about whether there are regions or local areas that have particularly high outcomes when you look at co-enrollment, meaning that somebody is participating in numerous public benefit programs. Another idea that came up from the group was whether there were specific types of workforce programs like apprenticeships that have a better impact on public benefit uptake. So basically, if you're an apprentice, does that mean you're less likely to need food aid down the line or more likely to end up in a healthcare program? So those are the types of questions that sort of added on to what the labor agency had prioritized. In addition to that, they came up with additional questions that the proposed data points could answer that went far beyond the things that the labor agency had laid out. So some examples to this would be how do barriers to participation and positive economic returns really vary based on the specific industry in which either people are employed or where they're getting trained? And how does participation look different for English language learners? And how do their employment outcomes differ for English speakers that might have the same demographics? So this might be a way for us to understand the Latino experience, whether or not they are English language learners. So what we really saw was some evidence that the data that the labor agency wants to provide really would enrich the types of research questions that our experts and practitioners would like more information about. Another thing that was part of the labor agency proposal, which I think is really interesting, is this issue of labor market information. So when Marianne was laying out what does C2C mean by workforce data, we were really digging into the fact that that term gets interpreted a lot of different ways. It can mean like a CTE class that a high school student is taking. It can mean what is the discipline that somebody is pursuing in a stackable credential program. It could mean how much money do people make after they finish their education and training. It can mean sort of what is happening in the larger economy that is driving demands for education or training. And so one of the things that's highlighted in the memo from the labor agency is this idea that in addition to looking at straight up outcomes for individuals after they pursue education or training, we need to understand what's happening in the workforce. What is the demand for workers? What skills are needed? And so a portion of that memo basically said there should be a function in the state that would enable us to better and more consistently understand how the labor market is evolving. And so the question posed was, would C2C be a logical place to put this feature, or would that be something that somebody else should do, but really raising this as a global need? This was reinforced by the input from the task force members. So when, we just sort of opened up the doors and said, what are the kinds of things that the task force members would like to have access to? There were a number of different places where they focused on the need for better or expanded information on demand. So some examples of those questions were what credentials and certifications are required or desired for specific jobs in specific industry sectors. So that's the idea that you could be looking at a manager, and what a manager needs to do in a construction field is really different than what a manager needs to do in a healthcare field, for example. Another example of a demand question raised by the task force members are what industries and occupations have the most urgent demand because they've got a large number of unfilled job openings. In addition to that, the task force members really dug into a sort of more nuanced way of understanding supply. So right now, typically when people do analyses about job openings, they're just looking at the discipline in which somebody earned a certificate or a degree. The problem with that is that you learn that someone was a psychology major, but the question is, did they learn things that are not only going to qualify them to go on and be a really good psychologist, but did they earn the skills that would help them be an effective manager, which is a high demand occupation? So some of the ways that the task force members dug into this was they asked questions like whether unfilled job openings aligned with training that's provided by programs like the Eligible Training Provider List, the ETPL. This is basically federal funding that people can access when they want to do job retraining after they're out in the workforce. Another example of the skills related question that people had was how well do education and workforce training programs align with the skills that employers are actually asking for, especially when we're trying to get students into high demand and emerging occupations where it may be a little bit less clear whether traditional academic programs are meeting evolving needs. So you can think about all the pressure that we're experiencing about AI as a place where we need a lot more skills information. So again, the input from the task force really reinforcing the messaging coming out of the labor agency and providing additional nuance. Um, then another portion of the meeting was that, as we mentioned earlier, the labor agency memo covered three topics, which was the labor market information, the information that they intended to provide, and the information that they were requesting from other types of agencies. So task force members also had the opportunity to add to that list of the types of information that they would like to see. And so I've grouped them here by data sources. So from the Department of Consumer Affairs, licensure data, from the Department of Motor Vehicles, information like whether people own cars, have a license, or have a disability placard, from Health and Human Services agencies, a lot of additional information about services like housing subsidies, in-home support, childcare program participation, but also more contextual information about individuals like their family status, measures of health, and behavioral health information. There was an interesting addition really focusing on unions as a source of information, thinking that it would be useful to know whether people are union members, and then also gathering qualitative information like success stories or priorities related to the business community, which loops back to that labor market analysis example. From the IRS, they were curious about fringe benefits. From the Social Security Administration, information about supplemental security income, SSI, and disability payments. And from the US Census, information on immigration status, date of arrival in the US, and country of origin. So I do want to emphasize that gathering input about information that you'd like to have does not guarantee that C2C is going to be able to get that, but this does add to the sense of the types of data that would need to supplement information that would be already provided as we continue to expand the opportunity to do research. All right, so before we go on to Judy's presentation to start to answer the questions that came out from the task force, I just wanted to pause for a moment to see if the task force members had any questions or comments. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to turn it over to Judy.
Thank you, Kathy. So as Kathy mentioned, during last month's meeting, we received several questions for C2C. We received a question about whether California uses an integrated data case management system across programs to be able to link data more easily. So there is a variance in service provision based on program requirements and funding streams that determine the use of case management systems. C2C leverages data that is already collected at the state level. State agencies will share data from local institutions with C2C, but C2C does not itself collect data. The P20W data system is centralized in C2C's data warehouse. We link the data after it has been securely imported into our system. However, it cannot be used to manage data for an individual. Linked data is used for data insights about aggregated data and not for direct service delivery for individuals. C2C also has privacy protections that adheres to strict state and federal standards, and these protections protect the privacy of individuals and limit who has access to that data. Next slide. The next question we received was about data governance. So the question is, what is the state doing to set up data governance structures so that data are interoperable and so there are privacy protections? C2C is committed to protecting confidential records of Californians. So all data that C2C shares with the public is de-identified and aggregated to only show groups rather than individuals. It also meets the office's suppression policy to protect privacy. So the data suppression protocol protects individuals within the P20W data system and is based on federal and state requirements. There's more information about C2C's security and privacy on our website that you can see and we'll share in a moment. As for interoperability within the state, it has mostly been done within sectors, for example, within education or within Cal HHS entities. The Office of Data and Innovation and the Chief Data Officer have developed a statewide data strategy, and there are major efforts underway. One of their goals is to accelerate adoption of modern data platforms to enable secure and efficient use of data, and that also includes interoperability. Next slide, please. Digital wallets. So the next question asks whether California is building digital wallets so people have control over their own education and training data and have ability to share it. So we are working closely with our partners at LWDA, the Community College Chancellor's Office, CalHR, GovOps, and the governor's office. We are strategizing about how to build a career passport, which would be California's version of a digital wallet or LER, a learning employment record. The California career passport is a customizable electronic record that people can use to share validated academic and non-academic skills when they apply for a job. It brings together information from two existing tools that fall under the Community College Chancellor's Office, including eTranscript California and MAP. It is envisioned as a tool that gives users control and allows them to choose and curate what to showcase to potential employers to demonstrate their skills for employment. With that, I'll pass it back over to Kathy.
So do task force members have any follow-up questions to Judy regarding those 3 points?
Just a quick question about the career passports. Is there another country or another state, but most likely another country that has a similar model?
Sure. There, as part of our eTranscript task force last year, we've looked into some of the models that other states have implemented, and there are a number of states that have their own version, and we are exploring the different models for implementation now.
Okay, thank you, Judy. So we're now going to transition over to answering the information about the labor agency data. Now, this is going to get a lot geekier, so those of you who like to know specifics of data, this should be a lot of fun. So has Abby rejoined?
Yes, I'm on.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's go ahead and get you started.
Okay. Thanks so much, Kathy. And I'm here actually at the labor agency in Sacramento, which has really bad wireless. So if I get kicked off again, I will come back on. But want to respond to some of the questions that were raised last time and offer a little bit of context for you all to understand. Before I do that, though, I just really want to thank publicly Brooke Volley and Amy Wallace and Nicole Laktosh, who really joined forces to respond to some of the questions that were posed. And I think just declare that we are on a journey together where we have a vision, we have a destination in mind. This will be a long journey, and we're excited to embark on it together with you. I think it's helpful for everyone to understand, and many of you may know this well, that under the agency umbrella of the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, we have 4 different departments that administer workforce funding and programs. These are the California Workforce Development Board, which primarily administers some of the special projects the state funds, such as the High Road Training Partnerships, the High Road Construction Careers. We have Javier's unit, the Workforce Services Branch of the Employment Development Department, that administers the federally funded WIOA programs, including adult, dislocated worker, youth, farm worker, discretionary dollars. We have the Employment Training Panel, which provides state payroll tax funding primarily to employers to upgrade the skills of their current workforce. And we have the Division of Apprenticeship Standards that sits under the Department of Industrial Relations that administers registered apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs for both adults and youth. And as you could imagine, or I will tell you, each of these departments has its own data systems with its own data definitions. And so, it was fortuitous when C2C approached us about joining forces this year on workforce data, because a very high priority of ours starting the year in July was to really work on and achieve greater consistency.
It looks like Abby has frozen. So Javier,
Yield the kinds of results that we've been talking about.
she's back.
You can move on, Kathy. So in terms of some of the data definitions, and I'm getting that internet unstable message, so let me know if I freeze. One of the questions was simply, what is workforce training? And as many of you who are experts in workforce know, that this is a very broad term that can include a variety of different kinds of training, including OJT, cohort-based training, basic skills and English language learning, pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship, which build skills and or provide credentials for better jobs. LWDA can provide information on the training overseen by our 4 departments, specialized grant programs, such as the High Road Training Partnership and the WIOA funded training programs, including the training provided via the local workforce boards for adults, dislocated workers, and youth, and other entities such as our labor partners and CBO partners who receive funding and administer those programs. There's a question about access to how access to training is defined. And really, at its simplest level, when somebody is recorded as having participated in one or more of the training programs listed above, and then some others, they've accessed the training. However, and this was, I think, inherent in another question. Sorry, I'm getting texts coming in. The eligibility requirements vary broadly by the program and the specific funding source for that program. Can move on, Kathy. There are also questions about what determines barriers to success. And we anticipate providing information that use the categories that are associated with federal funding to demark barriers to success and other factors, including household and family size, foster youth, homeless youth, justice involved in low income. However, information on each of these data points is not available for every type of LWDA program, as I just mentioned, because the requirements really differ in terms of eligibility, in terms of data collection on the funding source and the program design. I think where we have greater consistency is in program success. And we're tracking training completion, measurable skills gains, credential attainment, employment, and earnings, as those are relevant to each program. Earnings data is available, but on a lagged basis. Once the data are linked to C2C, we're excited about the potential to start looking at other outcomes data, such as post-secondary awards, and as Kathy was talking about earlier, the impact of training and credentials on the usage of public benefits. So to clarify some questions around services, we will provide information on whether people receive services and the type of services they receive. Some examples, and this is not exhaustive, will include basic career services that people may get through the job centers, such as job search assistance, individualized career services, such as career planning, supportive services, follow-up services, and vocational rehabilitation provided in partnership. And we're excited about some new and exciting local partnerships we're about to launch with the local DOR offices. Services, as you know and could imagine, really differ on the needs of the individuals, the program requirements, the needs of the labor market, and the specific program designed. There was a question that came up about whether LWDA has information on the extent to which people with young children are accessing childcare. This is information that is only available for a small subset of program participants where supportive services were provided, and the nature of those services are tracked and will not be available in an easily usable format. So that will be farther along on our journey together. And more clarifications to some of the questions around training. There was a very good question about, how do we identify the skills that employers are requesting to enter into C2C? The way in which the information is collected, it's really not possible to identify that now. But as Kathy talked about, I think some of our shared vision around improving LMI, I think we'd be excited in working on solutions. What we could provide and will provide to C2C around training programs are training type, the provider, the location, the type of service, the related occupation, related industry, program completion, and credential attainment, as those are relevant to each of the training programs. For training that is associated with academic institutions, excuse me, such as the community colleges, the program of study can also be provided. We'll be able to provide information on the duration of training programs based on the start and end dates. However, information on the exact number of hours of training and how many hours the participants participate in is not consistent across data sources. So at this point, that won't be included. And in terms of outcomes, it will be possible, and this is very important to us, as you saw in our memo, to identify and understand how outcomes differ based on participant characteristics, including demographics of age, race, ethnicity, gender, sex, disability, veteran status, educational level, and zip code, based on the information provided by participants and the numbers of individuals with each characteristics, just to get to scale to make those numbers relevant. It will be possible as well to identify how those outcomes differ based on the training characteristics, such as the length of training, the type of training, the specific occupation and industry focus areas. And it's the linking of these two that I think can really yield us some very rich information on program outcomes, with the kind of equity lens we all share. We are interested in cost per participant and capturing multiple information from multiple sources in C2C, which could help us all evaluate this more effectively, with a very important caveat that as we have invested dollars towards programs that serve people with multiple barriers, we recognize and have provided greater investment. So understanding cost per participant should not be driving a race to the bottom or a race towards lower cost services. We want to really focus on those outcomes, recognizing that for people who approach training and the labor market with barriers, that it will take greater investment, more training, more wraparound support, more co-enrollment to reach the kinds of outcomes we want to see people reach. And we think it will be possible to disaggregate outcomes based on whether the person was flagged as low income for those programs where the information is collected, such as the WIOA funded programs. Once those data are linked within C2C, other economic data may be available, such as prior earnings, if they accessed financial aid, and I would add, if possible, uptake of other public benefits such as CalFresh and CalWorks. And to respond to a few other questions, it's just not possible to know what additional assets individuals accrue after participating in workforce programs. The economic data points we'll have are really limited to earnings and credential attainment up to 1 year post-program. The information on the characteristics of employers that hire workforce training participants is limited to their industry. We would like to know, but do not yet have available, other data points, including the size of the employer, the definition of the sector, location of employment, which is really inconsistent across programs, that won't be included. And it's not possible at this moment to really, based on what's currently available in C2C and what we'll be providing to C2C in the P20 data set, to understand how labor market demand affects employment. But the information within the P20W data set could be and should be used to compare and supply and demand information from other sources, because this is really one of the most important things that we ultimately want to know. How are all of our programs collectively addressing labor market demand, and what impact do all of our collective training programs have on affecting that demand in specific regions? And there was a question from the last meeting about aligning definitions across programs so that users and frontline staff don't have to enter information every time they access services from different programs. And so, as I mentioned at the outset, each of the departments oversees workforce development programs in accordance with state and federal mandates, including data collection requirements on participants, services, and outcomes that are based on the respective funding sources and policies. And as I mentioned earlier, we're so excited about the opportunity to become part of C2C in a different, more meaningful way, and use that to really spur work we wanted to do internally anyways, which is aligning definitions and data standards across these different departments. And there was a question about different programs having different levels of intensity, some of which may be short-lived, and are there ways of providing the data to C2C that make the information more consistent? It is just the nature of our work that we offer programs of different levels of intensity and length, and then track those post-program outcomes, including program completion, all based on starting with participant needs, ideally the needs of the labor market, the design of the program, and federal and state requirements. We're not going to be able to address that variation currently through the data definitions. If programs change over time or begin and end during data collection, we think our best avenue, and we're excited to work on this with C2C, is to have a very strong data dictionary that clarifies what the data mean in any given year. And we'll excited about the opportunity to work with C2C on clear file upload specifications for each of the 4 departments and ensure that they're implemented consistently. And we look forward to working continuously with C2C to keep the data dictionary updated and relevant. And there was a question about how information is shared across service providers to determine eligibility. And as I think I mentioned earlier, while we share the vision of aligning eligibility information in ways that reduce duplicate data entry and collection, and then sharing that across service providers, with the differences not only among the departments, but across those departments among different funding streams and program types, they have different eligibility requirements, so the capacity for alignment is somewhat limited. But we think if we can do better aligning data definitions, having common data definitions, and aligning outcomes, that will really get us, a good start on the journey so that we can really better understand the impact of the programs and the impact on the individual on being served by multiple programs.
That was a lot of information. I really appreciate, Abby, you're sort of walking through that using plain language so that both the geeks and the folks that are just trying to understand how this information flows might function. So I want to ask the task force, does this answer your questions, or do you have a follow-up question that you want to ask Abby about the data that'll be available from LWDA? Lisa.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Abby. I have a question. I'm sure this is probably on everybody's mind, and I'm just curious, how is the state thinking about the fact that we've worked collectively, we've worked hard to be able to aggregate and disaggregate and slice and dice data in order to understand what works well and to better align services and eligibility requirements. And yet at the same time, all of the data specificity and the linkages, even though I know there's a whole host of protections involved, I'm almost surprised in a way to not hear any concern around the visibility that these systems maybe create for the federal government to either react against the fact that we're tracking this kind of data or otherwise target folks on the basis of that identification.
I mean, we have had multiple conversations with C2C about, and I think I would defer to you, Judy or Marianne, to answer more technically, but about the protection of that data and the, de-identification of that data so it's protected. But, we need to understand how different kinds of people succeed in different kinds of programs. Do you want to add to that, Marianne or Judy?
I'll just underline what Judy mentioned earlier about the importance of the data suppression protocol that was collaboratively developed for Cradle-to-Career, which has very detailed specifications around ensuring that the data is always presented for aggregate groups of people and protecting the individual identities.
Are there other questions from the task force? John.
Wanted to make sure I'm unmuted. Thank you very much for the presentations and the update before that. My questions are not as much about the output, but more on the input side. It seems like the LWDA systems are evolving towards having more standardization. So I've got two questions because of that evolution, no doubt taking some amount of time. To what degree can Cradle to Career accept data from LDWA systems that do not include certain data? It sounds like across the four departments there may be certain demographic data not entered in a standard way, or not captured purposely, or just because of the evolution of those systems. Once these data are matched up with the larger warehouse, can the C2C use demographics from other sources to augment the LWDA data? So that's the first question. I have a short question after that. I
Judy,
didn't
do you
know,
want to take that?
I didn't know if there were policies around once the data are in the warehouse, uh, can demographic information, say, as an example, be reused to augment other data?
Yes, that's actually one of the values of C2C is the ability to be able to link data across data sets that we receive from different state agencies. So for instance, demographics might be one, and we use probabilistic matching to do that, to create a golden record.
That's great. Great to hear. I mean, so that's really nice to hear for the short term while these systems evolve. I guess the other part of this is that it sounds like it seems from the goals, the questions that are being asked, the research questions that would be asked of the data, that there's an appetite for this, and these data would be used pretty quickly. That being the case, if there are changes over time, how will Cradle to Career standardize the inputs and outputs so that you could start to make comparisons year to year early on in this process?
So Cradle to Career will work closely with our data partners on documenting changing definitions. So I think that we'll have a process in place so that if the program changes, we'll be able to capture that as well in our data dictionaries.
I guess that would also address the outputs. Like maybe there might be standardized or semi-standardized outcomes that are uh, part of what's reported, that maybe those would stay static over time so that early comparisons can be made? Or would you, I don't know that you'd go back and adjust data in the past, but it's just to gain some value out of the year-to-year comparisons early on once the data starts flowing in a consistent way.
I can't answer exactly, depending on which product you're talking about, but we will include in our data products, we have lots of documentation. So if there are caveats to data, such as changes, that would be in the documentation that we would share as well, to explain any patterns or any things that might change, that might be unexpected or due to programmatic changes.
Thank you.
Terrence.
Hi, that spurred some interesting questions for me. I know you guys have been thinking about it. So just an example, running with the demographic data, you have two entities, let's say a K-12 and CSU, that collect ethnicity data with greater levels of detail. Like CSU, they got hundreds of categories. K-12 may have fewer. Maybe they define things a little differently. And so I'm thinking about the two things that can come up is you might have some really different schema, different categories that have to be reconciled. And then you may have the same individual be identified, have one ethnicity in say K-12, and then I have a different identification at a university. This feels like an example of something you guys have to think through, and how do you reconcile that, standardize it. And there may be times when a requester may say, okay, could I have the K-12 identification? Or someone may say, could I have the CSU identification? Or I could have the standardized reconciled identification. Is this something, I think it's in line with what John was talking about, and I'm thinking you guys have probably thought about this a lot, and it sounds complicated now that I say it out loud.
Thank you, Terrence, for that question. I think it is complicated. I would welcome other team members who might be better equipped to answer this to please jump in with more information about how C2C handles the different categorization of data points from different partners.
I'm happy to, but first I'd love to directly quote Terrence in future things for Cradle-to-Career. Like it sounds complicated now that I say it out loud. I think I'm going to write that down and put it on my office wall. The short answer is yes. The problem you identified comes up repeatedly for the exact reasons you mentioned. One individual may have their demographic information captured in different ways by different entities across different points in time. And so the very short answer to this is that the data system captures that difference in information. And if you're a researcher asking for specific data points in the future through our data request process, we can be thoughtful as we design that process to try to open up opportunities for researchers to define exactly what they would, if the higher education information, for example, you believe would be more relevant to your research question than K-12, perhaps there's a way for that nuance to come through. For the public-facing products on our website, oftentimes this is determined on a basis based on the question you're asking. So for example, if we have a visualization that starts with a cohort that begins in K-12, we may use the information from that K-12 cohort as what gets defined. More broadly for higher education right now, sometimes it means that categories need to be collapsed according to kind of what's common amongst all the higher education entities, and it makes it hard in visuals that draw from information across all systems to display anything other than the highest level category that at a minimum each system collects. So there's a long-winded way of saying this is definitely a challenge that exists anytime that data is linked across systems where it's collected in different ways, and how we address it is often specific to the data visualization that's being created.
Thank you.
I could weigh in with one more piece here. Hi, everybody. Ryan Estrellado, Director of Data Programs. Everything that Judy said, and also Marianne said, and then I'll add one more piece here, which is as much as we can, what I've noticed in my work with the data infrastructure team is in planning to receive the data. This is not always like 100% the case, but in general, there's an effort made to retain the data at the most detailed resolution as possible, the way it comes from the data providers. Of course, there's a conversation between the data providers and C2C, but wherever possible, I've noticed that we try to do that. And the reason why is because it then gives us the most options available to apply the business rule that makes sense for the particular use case, whether it is a dashboard or a research request or something like that. So the aim is to try and have the most options available for us to be able to say, pick recency or primacy as the business rule, and then within those, the different versions of recency available to us, because we know that if we roll it up sort of too much as before we receive it, then we have a situation where we just have less choices to pick from. So that's something that I've noticed that I thought would be helpful for y'all to know.
Thank you.
Annalise.
Yeah, I'm sorry for not being on camera. I'm in the airport. I appreciate the complexities involved here, and I was just wondering, I think it's great that you're thinking about a long-term plan for shared definitions. I'm curious if that goes into like the thinking about procurement requirements and, data system modernization efforts where you have vendors. Is that part of this process as well?
Annalise, are you talking about at the point of data collection at the labor agency, or are you thinking about the way C2C brings those definitions together?
I'm thinking about like if you're going to try to change definitions, you might have to wait for like a procurement cycle and then require it in the next contract with the vendor so that when it's collected, it follows the new definition.
That sounds like a labor agency question. Javier, do you have an answer to that?
I don't know. So, um, I don't know. My initial thought is, modernization is, we're all going to some, I wouldn't say all, but many of us are going through uh, something similar to that. Like, so all our systems and so on. So I think it's just incumbent upon us that are going to be providers that we do have systems and con vendors on board and how we contract with them that do allow for modifications as they need and so on. That's something we're thinking about as we bring on a vendor in the future and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think us as providers need to plan for that and how we bring on a vendor.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Jill.
I just had a question about what is defined as training, and I may have missed this, but knowing that there's a lot of nuance, so if someone gets like WIOA training services, the type of training that they could get under that funding source could be very different. And so just wondering whether information on that at that level is going to be captured. So if for us, like if they enroll in a community college course, or are they taking like a not for credit class? I mean, there's the intensity varies considerably. And so just wondering when we're evaluating some of this stuff, if that sort of like, I know the duration, but that's not necessarily intensity of services.
I mean, we should be able to provide data and, having Nicole help me out here on the nature of training that people are providing, that our people are provided. So I think we can understand them, whether it's OJT or classroom, and we have the duration and the training partner, we'll be able to piece some of that together.
Anything to add to that, Nicole? You're closer to the
Yeah.
data gathering.
No, I think what Abby said is absolutely correct. We can provide kind of that type of training, like it's an occupational skills training. Is it an OJT incumbent worker? We just can't get to kind of the very, very specifics, like we mentioned earlier, around the contact hours, maybe that person, or classroom hours that person is participating in.
I would also add one clarification based on the data that LWD has requested. So currently the community colleges are not providing course level information across the board. So it's not possible to know whether someone was enrolled in a non-credit or a credit course. That's one of the things that they requested from the community colleges, but it would be possible to see the type of program that somebody completed because the completion data is there.
And if I may just add, that's what's so exciting about this potential is that one of the things, our goals is like with the passport and so on, is that we're capturing and giving and recognizing alternative training modalities, such as person that brings work experience, has an OJT, gets remediation, gets some kind of short-term training, and then is positioned to go on beyond that. So that's what's exciting, being able to capture that. And we think we could bring some of that to the table.
Are there other questions from the task force? Well, I'll give you a moment and share a question that came from the community. So one of the folks from the public who's attending was curious about whether there is data on work permits for minors. So I don't believe that's one of the data points that LWDA was planning to provide. I don't know if you even collect that information. I'm seeing Nicole shake her head. I don't actually know where work permit data is located for minors.
Nicole, do you want to confirm that that's not data that we have?
On the WIOA side of the house, we do not collect that information.
Thank you for that clarification. All right. Well, again, I want to thank all of the labor agency folks to help provide all that detailed information so that we have a better understanding of what's going to be possible with the data that'll be added to C2C. So that moves us to the next part of the presentation or the session where we're really going to be, oh, wait, I just saw one more question that came in from the community, which is, will the information include agriculture industry? I don't know if you want to address what's in the NAICS codes that could be provided.
Yeah, so essentially anything that has a NAICS code, we would be providing that if there's a match for employment for that. So ag would be included.
And for those who are unfamiliar with the acronym, NAICS basically refers to the industry that somebody works in, and agriculture is one of those industries. Okay. So what we're going to pivot to next is one way to work on prioritization, which is to begin to think about if we have all these new data points that the labor agency is providing and is enriching the P20W data set, what is it that we want to have the public be able to easily access? And dashboards are normally the way that we sort of make data available. We're sort of curating answers to common questions. So before we dive into that, I'm going to invite Marianne Bates from Cradle-to-Career to talk to us a little bit about what you need to know before things like a dashboard gets developed by C2C.
Thank you, Kathy. So my job on this slide is to help situate how dashboards get developed as a part of a long-term effort. And the bottom line up front is we're asking for your input on what visuals you think would be useful, not because we'll be able to create those tomorrow, but because knowing that now can help shape all of the work that needs to precede that. So that's why we're asking you about it now, but I just want to be really clear in setting expectations that there is a host of work that Labor and Workforce Development Agency, its departments, and Cradle-to-Career will need to do just on all the steps that precede that. So just to walk through that a little bit, we're starting with the research questions first. And this includes the research questions that were in the memo from Secretary Knox that we already discussed in the last meeting. Those priority questions, your input on those priority questions is crucial because this entire effort is focused on what are the important questions that are hard to answer today, but could be addressed by connecting specific data points. So this exercise today in getting your input on potential dashboards and visuals is aimed to help us really focus on those research questions. Then that will help define which specific data points are needed or should be most prioritized. And then after that, there's a lot of work that we'll need to do within Labor and Workforce Development Agency departments that we'll need to do collaboratively at Cradle-to-Career to do file upload specifications, to make a detailed plan for ingesting the data, and to create the foundations for those detailed data dictionaries that we're hearing from you today will be so important. And that's all foundational even before we get to the actual data sharing, integration, and the build. So the main message here is all of those steps take time, but we do want to get your input starting now on potential visualizations because that can inform the priority research questions. It can inform the why of how we're doing this work. So big picture, your input today on these dashboards can help inform Cradle-to-Career's long-term plans and our work with our partners. But I just wanted to clarify, please don't expect these visualizations tomorrow because it will take some time to develop this, and we're not even in a position yet to estimate specific timelines for that. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Kathy.
Do task force members have any questions for Marianne before we go into the activities? Okay. All right, so what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to pivot over to a Google Doc. And what will happen is that we'll put a note in chat for the task force members so that you can access the document. And I'm going to display it on the screen so members of the public can see what you are writing. So, as Marianne mentioned, there's always a user-centered design process, that C2C uses to make sure that the information that's being posted, like we're really clear who's going to use that information and how are they going to use it, as opposed to just putting something up because it would be interesting. So this is where your expertise as task force members is going to be really important. So what we're going to ask you to do is answer 3 questions. Sort of like, what would a visualization show? So if, for example, you had a question that was like, I really want to understand whether participating in workforce training means you're less likely to have public benefits. Maybe what you have is like public benefit participation in workforce training, and then subsequent public benefit participation as a way to show the arc of relationship between those experiences. And then I could say, I want to use this information for policymakers. And I want to use it so they understand the value of workforce training related to managing public investments in the social safety net. So that would be an example of the kind of thinking that we're looking for in answers to these questions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen differently. So one moment. Make this bigger. And I'm going to reshare my screen. So are you all seeing the screen now? I can get a nod, yes or no. Can you see the screen? Yes, thank you. Okay, so task force members have editing ability, so please just go in and start typing now, and we're going to take a few minutes just to give folks a chance to put this information in.
Kathy, I could use a refresher of the list of data sets that were added. So what's the universe of data that we're supposed to consider here? The ones we suggested, or the ones the training data that so the core that the labor agency would provide. So having that either that slide or a list of data sets would be helpful.
So what I'll do, if Rocio, you could put a link to the memo from the labor agency into the chat for the task force members. But again, as
So
a
I have, I
refresher.
mean, I have that, right? But is there anything, I thought I was supposed to refer to the discussion from last time?
No, just look specifically at the data points that the labor agency has already committed. So we're basically looking at visualizations based on the information that would be available from the labor agency when we enrich P20W. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Okay, it looks like the writing is slowing down. Does anyone need another minute, or do you want to move on to discussion? I'm going to give you one more minute, and then I'm going to start asking some folks to voice over what they've written down. Okay. So, task force members, this document will remain open to you so you can finish your thoughts afterwards. But I want to take a moment to just sort of like point to some themes that I saw as I looked at this 10 plus pages of ideas that you have for visualization. So the first is I noticed that a number of you are talking about cross-sector pathways. So you're sort of looking at the idea that you're going to start, there was one down here that was about starting in K-12 and then looking and seeing what happens to people afterwards. So does anyone want to sort of unmute and highlight one of the things that you think would be most useful, like if you were going to prioritize which cross-sector pathways to focus on? Go ahead, John.
If no one else will, I see there were some similar items. Understanding that continuum from younger students as they start to develop an interest in certain occupations and work towards their pathway in K-12. There are a lot of programs at that level, from career technical ed to um, work-based learning experiences and the like. And it's been a long time goal to understand the impact of those programs within the K-12 environment. I just see that playing out at each level. That's also incoming data for um, um, the new data that we're talking about today, to understand. You could see where they're coming from. I know you probably capture that information wherever you can, when new students are in the intake process, but it should be valuable information from end to end. It may take a while to get there, but
Anyone else want to speak to sort of the cross sector? Cesar.
Yeah, and just as we kind of explore that, kind of using from career to cradle, and understanding kind of the different pathways that somebody might have in their evolution towards a career. So at this point, scan everything, understanding that you might have gaps, and you might have needs that need to be filled. So understanding people's progression from K-12 to either community colleges, apprenticeships, higher, CSUs, UCs, and others. I think it's critical to figure out where investments need to be made and where there's gaps in supports and services.
So you actually raised an interesting question in saying um, career to cradle. Would you want to actually start with the jobs and go backwards to see how people got there?
Well, a little bit of both, because I don't think there's enough data. I think we're comparing apples to oranges instead of apples to apples, and understanding that as we figure out where the needs are for employers in the state and the industry, we need to figure out kind of where we want to go, and then figure out how we could um, build the pipelines towards that. and it's kind of hard to do it from cradle to career instead of career to cradle where we want to be and then figure out the pipelines to get there, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, it's really interesting because we tend to look at supply and demand by looking at crosswalks of like occupational codes and program codes. And it's really different to say, how did someone become a manager? Did they do that by being a business major? Or did they do it by being a psychology major? Alex.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Cesar, your take on that of, backwards mapping versus starting from the beginning of, I can really see the value of starting with some career sectors, maybe especially in priority areas such as healthcare, education, things that are really needed across the state and that we see a lot of job need for, regardless of region. But that is really, as you said, Cesar, looking at just the folks who made it through that pathway. And it does miss the key folks of if you're wanting to examine student journeys across our different education institutions, that might leave out the students who ran into barriers and came out of the pathway. So eventually, kind of having that balance of both of being able to see at some point maybe, there's multiple versions of these diagrams that are more focused on the success, the people who were able to come through and the journeys they took to get there, and then identifying equity gaps or different barriers in that point and trying to target that specifically.
I was struck that a lot of oh, Terrence, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna augment what Alex said, that a lot of times you have to do, especially when we're starting this off, you'll probably have to do a both and like and also the longer the time gap between a starting and ending place, the more attrition you have. And so one of the things to think about is focusing on key transition points, like say elementary to middle school, high school to college, and have it. So then your time windows are a little bit shorter because even though it says cradle to career, it is, in practicality, you'll probably have a little bit too much drop off. And then there's that virtue of looking at the completers and, all right, where'd you come from? But then looking forward and seeing where some of the drop offs were, and then to unelegantly switch to a different thing. One of the things I was putting in there was advocating for centralized, standardized dashboards that help people report on key performance indicators required by the state on various projects like K-16 or Vision 2030, and getting more alignment of those in terms of like the graduation initiative for the UC and so on. So then folks like the policymakers, legislature, public can go to that one spot, and then we as the educators, training providers can also monitor our progress. And then that would help with folks have more resources for providing services and not as much duplication of effort around the reporting end. So that was the other thread I was putting in there. That's a little more sort of a pragmatic viewpoint than a specific visualization.
So one of the other things that I noticed looking across the things you put in there is how often you were actually looking for labor market information. That what you wanted to show was where was there a gap between available supply of people that had finished training programs and where there was need for jobs. I saw some sort of ideas that we could make that more complex in some of our existing supply and demand charts, which currently are only looking at educational attainment, because you would have workforce training programs as another important place that people are learning. So again, I think this is really showing that it blurs the line pretty quickly away from the way we have historically thought of P20W data sets. I mean, when you really look at what that W stands for in other states, it's normally just, did someone get a job and how much money are they earning? I shouldn't say just, that's actually a huge thing to be able to unlock, but still it's really different than trying to understand that in the context of what employers are looking for. And it gets back to that issue that skills might be an important missing piece in making sense of the relationships between the two. But still, that's another sort of important insight that I saw. Anyone else want to sort of comment on that LMI piece? Cesar.
Yeah, Someone on that, and also just the pathway for apprenticeships, and kind of, leaning in on what Governor Newsom said about needing 500,000 apprentices, and kind of where does that pipeline work? Because so often it's considered as people veer off course and then end up in apprentice program, and kind of how can we figure out that we could build those pipelines from K-12 or community colleges, and figure out is if there's a gap in apprentice programs in certain skills or certain industries. I think would be important as we talk about not just higher ed, but the apprenticeship programs.
Well, I think that fits with Terrence's earlier comment that looking sort of across all the different ways that people train for work and looking consistently at those outcomes and being sort of agnostic to the pathways to better understand where people are advancing would be a really different way for us to support pathway development than probably has been done in the past. I also noted that a lot of you were looking for comparisons where you wanted to be able to put different types of groups or training venues side by side. Anyone else want to sort of speak up about key issues related to comparisons?
Sorry, Kathy, do you mean creating comparison groups or benchmarking?
Well, what I was noticing is many of you were saying in the visualization that you want to do something like compare an academic pathway to a workforce training pathway, or compare outcomes in a rural versus urban area, or things like that. I'm just really more curious to see, like, are there other comparisons that people think are really important to prioritize? We've got a pretty good list in the visualizations, but that might be one more thing. If you haven't put down your rationale for those comparisons in the chart, that would be really helpful for the office to better understand. And I think the final thing that I would want to point out about what you suggested is often you were looking for the traditional P20W idea that you're looking at what are the employment and economic outcomes of individuals after participating in these programs. So it's important to note that C2C already has plans for a dashboard down the road that does show some of that, and some of the initial visualizations for the pathways diagrams that are under development right now include some employment and earnings outcomes. So that's very much in alignment, I think, with sort of the opportunities that the office is already moving on. All right, so we're very close to the end of our hour and a half. So what I want to do is sort of clarify what's going to happen in the next two meetings. So today's exercise was a really important way to think about prioritization, because again, there's so much information that we could have in this system, and there's a real cost to adding more information because of what it takes to ingest and map and then sort of manage an ever larger data set. So C2C is the biggest linked data set in the country right now. I think that's important. That's just at a state level. And so what we want to do next time is really focus on all those new data points that you all identified that are not currently either what LWDA has said they want to provide or is currently in the P20W data set. So I have to say, as a researcher, I get really excited when I think about opportunities, and I'm the first to come up with a long list of additional things that I might like to have. But I think it's really important, if you're going to be advising the governing board for C2C, is to say what is most important to have. That if there were opportunities down the road for C2C to further expand, what would that be? So we're really going to dig into helping you understand the way that you would have to change things within C2C to add additional data, and then ask you to tell us what you think is most important. And then that will lead us to the final meeting of the task force, which is where we'll put together sort of a draft write-up summarizing the input that you provided. And then that information is going to be shared with the governing board to be able to help inform the priorities that they're going to set as they're thinking about ways that the workforce component of C2C could be expanded over time. So again, I really want to thank everyone for your time and your expertise and the dozens of good suggestions that you put in with the prioritization. And want to see, is there anything else that the C2C team wants to share before we close out?
Lots of appreciation for your time and expertise today and throughout this process.
Thank you, everyone. And we will be posting this recording and the notes at the website on C2C. So please come back for next month too. Thank you.